Hello, I'm Jesse Trucks. I am the Minister of Magic at Splunk. I'm a security advisor to our partners and a partner organization, as well as other public sector accounts. I've been in security operations and IT operations for a couple decades, and I've worked in a variety of situations from small mom and pop shops all the way up to Oak Ridge National Laboratory for the Department of Energy, and of course now Splunk for almost 6 years now. And I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. Hey, Alex.
Hey, so Alex Kirk, I am the Global Principal for Suricata here at Corelight. I'm also an industry veteran. I've been a kind of a commercial open source guy, working first at SourceFire with the research department, and then later Cisco as a sales engineer covering enterprise brand name accounts. I've also done time with Tenable before being here at Corelight for the past year and a half.
So, Alex, what are we covering today, and what do you want people to walk away with? What are the three key points?
Okay, so we're talking about Corelight authored playbooks for Splunk Phantom that are designed to, number one, reduce the number of alerts that analysts are actually going to have to process. Number two, cut the time to resolution on the ones that humans do need to review. And three, really helps improve the consistency of analytical results across what can be an inconsistent skill set among analysts. This takes the process of actually investigating an alert and make sure that it's that same process across a tier one or a seasoned veteran. So to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here, we've got on screen here within Splunk a record from Corelight Suricata logs, which is actually just an IDS hit wrapped in a Corelight style log. And we're going after a potentially malicious DNS name, which is a very common sort of a task you'll see in every SOC. They're going to have large numbers of these alerts being generated out of an IDS. And so what we're going to do is feed this into this Phantom playbook that is going to walk through and do some validation of whether or not that query was successful, and if so, what was actually done on the resulting connection. And then we're going to talk as well about a playbook that might follow up to a conviction out of that previous playbook where you say, I think this IP has been compromised, and I want to now come in and get a report on everything that it's been doing with a potential differential from before and after that point in time where the infection may have occurred. And then we're going to go ahead and walk through not only the details of how these playbooks are put together, but the output of what they're going to look like in the investigative phase and what an analyst would see and take out of these playbooks.
So, Alex, looking at this playbook, it looks like a whole lot of stuff is going on. Tell me how the event in Splunk that came from the Corelight sensor, how does that get into here, and what happens in here? What's going on, like those first row up top there?
Okay, so in terms of getting this into Phantom, it would be a real simple save search on the Splunk side that would just look for signature IDs that are associated to potentially malicious DNS lookups. We actually have a list that we're maintaining of those signature IDs on our GitHub, so that's a real easy kind of a plug and play thing for you. But what's going to happen once we have that alert actually inside of Phantom here, the first important piece of the puzzle is we're going to query into the Corelight DNS logs to get information about that DNS lookup. And the way that we're doing that is you see here in the Suricata event, there is a UID associated to the event. That is a piece of glue that Corelight uses to link logs across a given connection. And it's appended to all of our Suricata alerts by default now so that it's very easy to pivot between those alerts and the metadata that's associated to them. So what we're going to do is have this UID be an artifact that is loaded as part of the importation into Phantom. And then if we come into the first query format here, we see that we're going to be doing a search against the Corelight index, although of course changes is appropriate for your naming scheme, within the DNS logs with a parameter of that UID that we're pulling in from the alert And we're going to say basically from the timestamp that alert was generated up until now for the search for those logs, and pull that back in and grab some information that is going to allow us to come in here in this custom function and figure out, first of all, were there any answers to that query at all? Because sometimes you'll get an NX domain back, perhaps a firewall blocks a query, and there's no answer actually returned. And at that point, our logic is going to end processing of this, and you're going to be able to kick this out of the analyst queue as something that was ultimately unsuccessful and thus not worth, chasing down the rest of the rabbit hole and validating. But assuming that answers actually were returned, this function here goes through and validates which ones are IP addresses, as opposed to more names that would then be recursively looked up and turn into kind of a programming mess. But then take those IP addresses and go ahead and run a query that essentially boils down to, did the system that made the query for that name actually make a connection back to the IP address that was returned in the answer? And again, only proceed forward if we find that there is data of more than 0 bytes being transferred as part of that connection. Because again, if you send a SYN out to one of those IP addresses and it never acts back, you can't possibly have an interaction with it, and it's not worth that human touch. But in the event that you actually do have information coming back across that stream, we're going to come through and actually begin to investigate a little bit. And so what that kind of consists of, if we dive over into this part of the playbook, is first, we're doing a basic filter for what service is actually being spoken across these connections. And if it's HTTP, then we're going to go ahead and again grab that IP address from that previous condition, grab that UID, and go ahead and query the Corelight HTTP logs for the host name, the URI, the method there, the user agent string, the refer that sent you to this page, and go ahead and put all of that information into a note within Phantom, which is actually a good time to kind of take a side note and talk about the fact that in a production environment, we understand that a lot of folks are going to be integrating this directly into the ticketing system of their choice, as opposed to, working with notes and pins and cases directly within Phantom. And, I think, Jesse, that's really one of the strengths of Phantom in terms of integrating workflow, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So at the end of this, you can have it do anything you want. You can send the data somewhere else. You can open a ServiceNow ticket, access some other ticketing system, for instance, or do a note or do all of these things, and which is really wonderful. And so all of the results of this can be packaged up to be consumed or analyzed by a human or an automated process of some sort, or even going out and actually performing actions on the resultant systems. And while I'm looking at this, it looks like you've got all of these actions are happening in parallel. So this branches off and it fires off all 4 of these and does this investigation at once. And what are the sources of the data that it's getting all of this information from?
Well, I mean, again, this is all coming directly out of the Corelight logs. You can see that for SSL, we collect a different set of information than HTTP, obviously, but again, it's coming from that same source. One of the other things that the Corelight device can do that is kind of uncommon in the security marketplace is we're pulling out files from all the different protocols that we parse at line speed. We've actually got one customer pulling 15,000 files per minute. And it's going to actually automatically hash all of those files as they come through. so that, while it's possible with the device to get a copy of those exported files and put them in a sandbox, or throw them into a DLP system or whatever you have, the simple thing for us is to say, hey, I want to pop this into a file reputation system of my choice, whether it be, again, a VirusTotal or a Cisco Threat Grid, or whatever may have you. But if we get a file reputation positive hit on this thing, then it's real easy to pop up an alert and say, hey, we know that this is a piece of malware, just from having grabbed the hash and automatically checked it online. And again, we're taking all that Suricata data and also kind of coming back and saying, for all these resultant connections that have come through, were there any Suricata alerts generated on those connections, so that you have, not just the ability to kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak, with a group of alerts, but you also get that additional context beyond just the first alert that says, hey, maybe this is a nasty domain name. It's, oh, and it did these other terrible things on the resulting connections. So it's really designed to give you a lot of the information that an analyst would want to look up manually when they're doing an interrogation like this.
So speaking of how an analyst views this, so it does all this stuff. How do I look at this? Can you show me what this looks like?
Sure. So I've got over here an event container within Phantom, and we've already pre-populated the artifact information about that original UID and timestamp, just for ease of use here. But then what we're going to want to do is come through here and hit Playbook, and we're going to choose Corelight Investigate DNS Alert. And note, of course, that in a production environment, this is going to be kind of all automated by your Phantom admins. But for the sake of showing it to you today, we're going to go ahead and manually run this playbook. And we're going to see over here in the recent activity tab that we've got all of those different actions that we saw in the previous flowchart actually being run. And so if we come into any one of these pieces of the puzzle, we're going to see, all right, well, here's the query as it actually ended up being sent to Splunk. And here are the results that come out. So we're going to know that this is the domain name that we're investigating. There was, in fact, an answer. And then we can find out going down the line here. All right, there was one connection that was made to that IP that has this UID. And it generated, just a single HTTP request, but to an odd file name that looks suspicious on its own, but in that file reputation is going to come back as detected by a VirusTotal. And we're also, of course, going to see that there are multiple Suricata alerts that are generated on these resultant connections as well. So it's very easy as an analyst to kind of quickly come through all this information that, if they were manually typing away at the keyboard, hopefully not making too many typos as they go through, waiting for, results to return. Instead, they're able to just make a series of quick clicks and get all that information and take the time spent doing this investigation from minutes down to potentially seconds to remediation.
That's pretty amazing. It did run very fast. You can even see there, and it tells you, the timeline over there on the recent activity. It's pretty powerful what you've built here. And it's also impressive to me that you can pull all of this from the same data sources. And so I can imagine that this runs just this quickly in production too, if obviously you scale your environment out.
Well, and that's kind of the beauty of this, in that the pre-correlation of that UID amongst all these different logs makes it a lot simpler on Splunk to run these queries than if I was trying to patch this together from a whole bunch of disparate data sources and get an increasingly complex query in the process.
Okay, Alex. So we've done this investigation with the previous playbook. You had all this information and you see some smoking guns or some suspicious IPs. How do you use this second playbook to investigate further and save you a lot of time doing that?
So it's actually real straightforward. The second playbook takes a pair of inputs. One is just the IP address that you want to interrogate. And the second is an optional timestamp at which you think that a compromise may have occurred, so that we can do some differential of before and after that. But fundamentally, what this is doing is starting out and saying, I want a query of all the external IP addresses that this host has talked to in what is a configurable lookback window of time. Basically, if you come into the community function for date time modifications that's just provided by Phantom, you can tell it how far back in time you want to look in days. And then that comes into this query that essentially pulls out information on all the IP addresses and services that are being spoken to, again, externally to start with. This piece here leverages custom tables within Phantom to allow you to supply a whitelist so that you're not just generating a report on every single connection to Google that's been made by the system, but you can filter out some of that generic noise and focus on things that matter more. And then once you've passed through that whitelist, we're doing a very simple filter to check for what the service actually was that was detected, and similar to the previous playbook, giving you a report on HTTP, SSL, DNS queries, as well as if any services that were not in that list were spoken. For example, RDP might be something very interesting if that suddenly shows up on a system like that. But then from there, in parallel, again, we're coming through and doing the same thing for internal connections within the network. And then we've got a very different set of protocols that we're reporting on for east-west traffic, so that you're looking at things like SMB, DCERPC, Kerberos, or NTLM. Again, all pulling just directly out of the Corelight logs, so that it's very simple to kind of manage and maintain here. And then finally, it's coming through and giving you additional information on both Suricata events that had been generated, as well as Corelight actually maintains a software inventory for hosts on the network by passively listening to things like banner strings and looking at TCP/IP fingerprints. We can do stuff like tell you that there is an Apache 2 point whatever box running on this Linux system. And so it kind of orients you to what sorts of tools are actually being used on that system in addition to all of this connection information. And then finally, up at the top here, it's doing that differential based upon the time stamp that you supplied of what are the connections that were being made internally and externally prior to that time, and then what are the connections being made after that time, and essentially giving you a report, again, in a note here in Phantom, based upon which systems have been connected to since that suspected time of compromise, but were not connected to prior to that time of compromise. So that, again, it's designed to help malicious connections jump out on the page for the analyst at that point of getting the report.
And that's where, like you in the other playbook, you could substitute inserting more information into a ticket or creating a ticket and those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally extensible throughout, the entire Phantom app marketplace, which I'm impressed is very extensive. I think it's like 200 plus integrations that you guys maintain in there. But to
yes,
show
and counting.
Yes, to show you a little bit about what this is going to look like, we're going to come back in to one of these, and I've pre-populated because, of course, this does take a hair longer to actually run, kind of due to the more comprehensive nature of the data that we're pulling. But you're going to get that list of connections that are being made outbound by this system as well as internally, so that you can see, what kind of resources and protocols are being spoken. We're going to get, for example, in this SSL query, we're going to see that this machine has been talking to a system with an expired certificate on TLS 1.0, as well as some self-signed ones on that older protocol. which is actually surprisingly common. We find with malware authors out in the wild don't necessarily do a good job of signing SSL certificates, for example, because it's a great way to get tripped up by Interpol or somebody in the process of trying to validate identity. But again, we're going to have all this information at an analyst's fingertips so that they can say, hey, I see that this box is in real trouble at this point based upon this large number of Suricata alerts that's being generated and these strange external connections being made. And now I have all of this in a report with, again, the queries that you could then use to pivot back into Splunk to do sort of additional tracking down of some of the things that you might have seen along the way.
That's pretty amazing. And to pull all of that information into an easily digestible form, coming from one data source, one sensor. And I can see how the three things that you said we were going to look at is how to reduce the number of alerts that analysts see. And I think by doing all this investigation, automatically, you're going to reduce that. And also, of course, cutting time to resolution. I think that's pretty obvious. This all ran in a handful of seconds. Even the second playbook, I think, was, only took a couple of minutes for the whole thing. Not even that, really. If I remember correctly, it was like 30, 40, 50 seconds, depending on your environment.
The beauty of that, too, is that it takes a lot of mental cycles that an analyst would have to spend on making sure that they're constructing these queries appropriately, and just even the mundanity of kind of copying and pasting between different windows and making sure that you're detail oriented on something that is often a little bit mind numbing. It is one of the beauties of getting this done in the Phantom framework, is that you can get rid of all of that mental effort and replace it with much higher level analytical thoughts instead.
Yeah, so kind of like Brian and I were talking about the previous webinar, and I know you were part of that or party to that conversation. I was talking about how it's all about analyst mental processing, because we're humans, and how our brains function when we task switch and context switch, going back, into the thing, copying and paste, going into a different tool, and then going back and forth to different tools. That takes a huge amount of time, not just the time copying and pasting, but it actually slows down our ability to perform decisions, because it literally uses up executive function, and we only have so much before we're exhausted and we have trouble making decisions. And by cutting that time down and reducing that kind of mental, as well as time on the wall, time and energy, then you get to the third point, which is improving decision quality across inconsistent analyst skills, or even just for an overloaded analyst. If I'm looking at my 17th ticket for the day, or 17th event or incident, I'm going to be exhausted. But
to hit all these different branches individually, because any one of them may have that smoking gun.
Absolutely. And so by having Corelight sensor bring that high level of fidelity of information, especially the wireline data, and then Suricata carving off all kinds of information about files, bringing that into Splunk, alerting on those things, bringing that into Phantom and using these playbooks, I can see saving an incredible amount of time and on analytics, because very easily, in some, it's obviously not with the one you found with all those problems in the data, but in some cases, it is a false positive. And instead of spending 30 minutes figuring that out, I can spend 2 minutes.
Exactly. And that's really what we're going after with this series of playbooks. And I'll note too that while we've got just these two published on our GitHub to date, the plan is to actually write a number of these playbooks that target those kind of core SOC processes that you're dealing with on such a regular basis that you're doing every day, and trying to make those so much more efficient that you can get through the pile of alerts that are coming into the SOC, and actually have some time to be perhaps proactively looking through your network data, or working with the NOC team to improve compliance based upon things you've seen in the data along the way.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at this process, and I know I've saw, you and I've seen behind the scenes of the creation of these playbooks. This was people should know that this was a coordinated effort between Corelight and Splunk to make sure that these are the best, most efficient playbooks that would do this job for us. And so, and I think that also it's important to understand that going forward, you're going to have expert Corelight engineers and expert Splunk engineers working together to produce these playbooks. And so you basically can download the expertise of expert Corelight and Splunk engineers and install it in your environment, do a few tweaks if you need to, and then go. And so that takes a huge burden off each of the users, as well as the people maintaining the platform in any particular environment.
Well, exactly. And part of the reason that Corelight data actually makes it so much simpler to get in and start getting meaningful results out of Phantom is that it's providing all of this pre-correlated data across the entirety of your network operations. And you don't have to maintain and manage the logging off of your firewalls and your mail servers and your web servers and all these other places that are potential points of failure. And so instead of having to do a lot of the data acquisition and normalization and spend all those cycles on what is really kind of a mundane part of the process that most people forget to even think about, you've got a turnkey sort of a way to have all that information that drives right into these processes that you can download and run with.
I think that's excellent. I think it's exciting that we live in the modern world, really, in the future here, because the amount of work, just looking at the visuals of the playbooks, you can see how much work is happening, and each one of those is doing something complicated. And I think it's amazing. We can basically, at a few clicks of a button through the Phantom interface, you can download essentially, you can download a Corelight and Phantom expert.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Is there any last things you'd like to comments? Where can people go? I know you can go to Splunk.com and download a trial version of Phantom. You can contact us for getting licensing information. But what can you do? Tell us how to get started with Corelight.
So if you go to corelight.com under use cases, there's a brand new SOAR section that outlines what we've talked about here today, as well as has information on getting in touch with a Corelight rep. So we would love to set you up with a plug and play eval on this and show you the power of it all in your own network.
That's awesome, Alex. I look forward to seeing the new playbooks as they come out, and I'm sure you'll take requests to see what the user base out there needs. So customers, people needing this, tell us what you need, and we'll see if we can make it for you. Thank you very much, Alex, and I hope you have a fantastic day. And I look forward to possibly more webinars in the future.
Yep, it's been good working with you, and looking forward to plenty more of it.